So today's daf is daf Chav Ches. Hopefully we'll have enough koach for that. And we're up to Tana Rabbana. And we enter into a bit of an agadah over here. Tana Rabbana. Yes. Maise Rabbi Eliezer Sheshavas Begolil HaElyon. He spent Shabbos in the upper Golil. Ushayluha Shloshim Halachos Behilchas Sukkah. I guess the local citizens asked him 30 questions regarding Hilchas Sukkah. 12 out of the 30 he heard, meaning he got a tradition, he received a tradition from his Rebbeim, and he had answers to those questions. But with regard to the balance of the 18, he said to them, Lo Shamati, I have no tradition. And if there's no tradition, I have nothing to say to you. Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda Omer, he had a slightly different version of the story. Chiluf HaDvarim, Shmona Asar Amar Lehem Shamati. He heard the answers to 18 of the 30 questions. U'shtei Amar Lehem Lo Shamati. But 12, he did not hear. Amru Lo. So they said to him in a certain, I guess you might say, a facetious tone, Kol dvarecha eincha, einon el mipi hashmua. I mean, all you could teach us is what you heard. I mean, didn't you put in any work of your own? Implying, maybe you're a little bit laid back in your learning here. How would it be that, the only thing you know how to tell us is what you heard? Okay, so that itself is an accomplishment, to remember what you heard, but you haven't added a thing. We think that Torah scholars are meant to be creative and have fertile minds on their own. They can answer questions that never came up in the past based on their knowledge, and they should analyze these questions, come up with answers. Omalahem, and now it's in a very, very atypical way. We don't find this usually in Shas. He is going, Rabbi Eliezer, he's going to defend himself and demonstrate to them that he really puts in a hard day's work in Torah studies. He's not laid back about it. Gaktuni Lomar, you have forced me to say, I'm going to tell you something about myself and about my self-imposed requirements and standards for learning. I didn't hear this from my Rebbeim. This is my own achievement in learning. And I never would have shared it with you, but you're forcing me to do so because what's at stake here is the honor of Torah. You're implying that, the Torah that I have is and the amount of work and toil that I put into Torah is not perfect. I'll tell you what you should know about me. Don't think I'm laid back. I'm always there early to open up the Beis Medrash. No one came before me. I was very careful about upholding the sanctity of the Beis HaMedrash. And this is based on a Gemara in Brachos, that the sanctity of Beis HaMidrash is even greater than that of a Beis HaKnesses. Lo shenas keva v'lo shenas haroy. Now, technically, you'd be allowed to take a little nap in a Beis HaMedrash. You can't sleep in a Beis HaMedrash. You can sleep perhaps in a shul, but not in a Beis HaMedrash. However, he was machmir on himself. As we said before, he was so careful about the sanctity of the Beis HaMedrash that he wouldn't allow himself even a nap. Not only was the person to open up the Beis Medrash in the morning, I closed the lights at the end of the day. No one was left in the Beis Medrash after. And I'm assuming this Beis Medrash was, although the Gemara doesn't spell this out, was probably an exciting place. There were many, many students. Lo sachti sichas chulim. Now here he doesn't mention Beis HaMedrash. It could be that this particular statement is further indication of his dedication, his exclusive dedication to Torah study. And there was no time for any sichas chulim. You want to schmooze, find someone else to schmooze with, not me. And now we get to the punchline. You're asking me, why is it that I can only give you the answers that I heard from my Rebbeim? And the answer is, Lo amarti davar shelo shamati mipi Rebbe me'olam. I never ever, me'olam, would transmit Torah that I didn't hear from my Rebbe. I see myself as a link in what's called the Masorah. There's so much significance in the Masorah. I'm very dedicated to my Torah studies. I'm the first to open up and the last to go out. However, if I did not get a horah and I did not receive a tradition and a psak from my Rebbeim, then I left the question unanswered. Because my assumption is that whatever they knew, they would transmit to me. And I'm not going to give you my own opinion because I accepted upon myself a higher standard of what's called Mesiras HaTorah, based on the Masorah. And I will only transmit that which I heard from my Rebbeim. If my Rebbeim didn't give me an answer, if they didn't address your questions, I don't feel myself worthy of addressing your questions. Now, Lefi Aniyas Daiti, again, I don't want to prejudice you, but this is my humble opinion. You can take it or leave it. I don't believe that the Torah doesn't allow for chidush. But I think that what perhaps Rabbi Eliezer is telling us is that he received from his Rebbeim a certain methodology. He has a derech. They taught him how to analyze questions. And surely if he can anticipate what his Rebbeim would have answered to a particular question, even though he didn't hear their answer, he didn't receive it from them, but he was absolutely sure, based on the methodology, the rules of the game that they had taught him, he could absolutely be certain that this is what they said. It's absolutely crystal clear. But when they asked him questions, and it was outside of the purview of his methodology, that's already considered Davachol Shamati Mipi Rebbe. I never even heard from my Rebbeim how to analyze and with what rules and regulations I should approach that question. Like, for example, in logic, right? I remember I took a course in logic in college. So there are certain rules of logic. The logic is not going to tell you the answer to every question. You have to work it out based on the symbols and the analytic principles. But you have a methodology. So that I believe from the bottom of my heart that Rabbi Eliezer would have answered questions on his own, even if he didn't hear the answers directly from his Rebbeim, but only if he felt that he could be absolutely sure and anticipate what his Rebbeim would have said. Now, once the Brisa we quoted earlier tells us about Rabbi Eliezer, the Gemara goes back to the Rebbe of Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer was a Talmud of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. So the Gemara now quotes another Brisa. Amar Olav al Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. Number one, mi yomav lo sach sichas. He never spoke about anything outside of Torah learning. So you see to what extent Rabbi Eliezer was a duplicate of his Rebbe, accepting that high standard of behavior. And now the Gemara, quoting the Brisa, tells us something very unique about Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. Olach arba amos below Torah ubelow tefillin. Now there are two ways of reading this Gemara. One way is to take it literally, and I would not question that. But with regard to tefillin, I understand that he was always wearing tefillin. With regard to Torah, Torah is not something that you wear. And therefore, what would it mean if you took this Gemara literally, that he never walked 4 hours without Torah? I'd like to suggest the Rambam in the third parak of Hilchos Talmud Torah has what's called Kesed Torah. Now, Kesed Torah is not a physical crown that you wear on your head, but it indicates that your head and your nefesh is totally dedicated to Torah. So it could be that we could split between below Torah and below Tefillin. Below Tefillin, we should take literally. But below Torah, we should have an understanding. This is a reference to Kesed Torah. And the Rambam says about someone who wants to be Zoch in Kesed Torah, lo yasiach daito l'dvar macherim. He should not be distracted from his Torah learning. And if that be the case, then I understand the emphasis on Arba Amos. Arba Amos is considered a significant amount of relocation, right? Relocating yourself. In other words, your circumference, so to speak, is the 4 Amos around you. And the Bryce wants to emphasize that Rabbi Yochanan Zakkai always was connected to Torah. He never was Mesiach Das from Torah. Anything that he saw, anything that he experienced, he always put it into a Torah perspective. And again, lo kodmo odam b'beis hamedrash, lo yasham beis hamedrash, lo shenas keva, lo shenas haroi. And these again are two expressions of the behavior of Rabbi Yochanan Zakkai, which were transmitted to his great Talmud Rabbi Eliezer, who followed suit. And now we find out another unique element about Rabbi Yochanan Zakkai. Now, if you have a mavoi, which is some sort of an alleyway or a passageway, and it's mitunaf, like there's species there or other refuse, then technically speaking, the law would be you're not allowed to speak divrei Torah, but thoughts of divrei Torah might be permissible. And this is a big issue in the poskim. And I would assume that Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was of the opinion that hirhur lav kedivrei Torah, meaning there would be no prohibition that would enjoin him from thinking divrei Torah these mavot samatunofs. But yet he was machmer al atzmo, and again, this is because of his dedication to what we call kedushas haTorah. Now, kedushas haTorah is not just a physical sefer Torah. Kedushas haTorah means Torah thoughts. When a person is thinking Torah thoughts, he's already created some sort of entity of Torah. And that expresses itself in the fact that he's not allowed to think Torah thoughts, for example, in a bathhouse or in a bathroom. Imavos mitunafos, perhaps Rabbi Yochanan Zakkai held that Mikra Adin, according to strict letter law, you're allowed to think Torah thoughts, but he nevertheless avoided it. This was his chumrah. You can never find him sitting idly, dome, as if his mind was just wandering. Eliyoshev Vishona. He was always preoccupied with learning. That's Kesed Torah. I heard a story once from my Rebbe that his grandfather, Reb Chaim, asked Reb Moshe Soloveitchik in the middle of the day, he says, what are you thinking about? Tell me the sugya that you're working on. And Reb Moshe was caught off guard. And he was embarrassed because he didn't have the sugya in his mind. The next time the Chaim asked him, what are you thinking about? Reb Moshe told him he was thinking about the most complicated question about a Chatzi Eved Chatzi Ben Chorin who is a Suffolk androgynous and whether he's a Chayiv in the superior agreement is Yuchsa. I mean, a very complicated question. Lo pasach adam delis l'talmidov elahu biatzmo. Now, what this is about, this is what you call independence. A person, right? Chazal say, based on the pasuk in Mishlei, it says, "Soni matonis yichya." A person should not feel that he's always dependent upon others, and therefore, you know what? He didn't want the covered from his talmidim. They certainly wanted to honor him and open the doors for him, but he would do it for himself. And here's where Rabbi Eliezer was following in the footsteps of his Rebbe, Rabbi Yochanan, who never transmitted Torah unless he heard it from his Rebbe. And even if he was mechadish chidushim, it's as if he heard those chidushim from his Rebbe, because it's based on anticipating what his Rebbe would say. The whole year round, 363 out of 365 days of the calendar, the Hebrew calendar, of the solar calendar, he would be involved in learning, and the Beis Medrash would be open. He would never make a declaration, let's close the Beis Medrash, except for two days, or a day and a half, I would call it. Chutzmi, number one, Arvei Pesachim, on Erev Pesach, when we should be dedicating ourselves to preparing for the Korban Pesach. And even if we don't have the Korban Pesach, there are plenty of other parts of the Leil HaSeder that we need to be involved in. And not only that, it could very well be that Rabbi Yochanan felt it's important for the children to leave the Beis Medrash on Erev Pesach and get a good rest, so they shouldn't be tired for the Seder. And the Arva Yom Kippurim, there's a mitzvah achila and chesia on Erev Yom Kippur, and it's time for the children to go home, close the tashbar, the Beis Medrash for children, and see to it that the children are eating properly, a mitzvah achila on Erev Yom Kippur. V'chein, this is the culmination of this entire brisa. Now, although we didn't find Rabbi Eliezer himself boasting, so to speak, about every single issue or every single manifestation of the dedication of Rabbi Yochanan Zakkai to Torah, but we could suffice it to say that this closing line is going to include everything that we saw in the list about Rabbi Yochanan Zakkai. Now, once we discuss Rabbi Yochanan Zakkai, the Gemara is going to tell us more about Rabbi Yochanan Zakkai. Shmonim Talmidim Hoyelo Lehil HaZaken. Right, there were two hills, Hill the first and Hill the second. So we're not going back to Hill the first. So it's Hill the second who organized the calendar first, but we're talking about Hill the first. And he had 80 students. Now, I'm not sure if that means he had only 80, or these were the 80 outstanding students. Shloshimim, out of this group of 80, 30 of them were Ra'uyim Shetishra Aleim Shechina Kim Moshe Rabbeinu. And that means that the greatness of Moshe Rabbeinu was that he had Shechina, and the Gemara says about Moshe Rabbeinu, Shechina Medaberes Mitot Rono, and here are 30 students way later, historically down the line, and they also had the Bechina of a Moshe Rabbeinu. Shloshim and 30, and my impression is that this is another 30 out of the 80. So we've got 30 that are royal Shechina like Moshe Rabbeinu, and now we have another 30 that are on the level of Yoshua. Yoshua ben Nun. Yoshua ben Nun is, Shamash Begimam Tov, was able to stop the sun miraculously from setting, so that the people would continue in the battle. And who could be on the level of Yeshua ben Nun, the great disciple of Moshe Rabbeinu, and hold up the sun? And yet, Hillel HaZaken had 30 students who were on that level. Then there were 20 Beinanim. So we've got 30, 30, and 20. So we're up to the lowest level. We've covered the first 60. Now we're up to the last 20. Hagadol Shebekulam, the greatest of those 20, was Yonasan ben Uziel. He was the greatest of the last 20. And Katan Shebekulam, number 80 on the list, was Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. Could you imagine? There were 78 students of Hillel HaZaken that were greater than Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. It's mind-boggling.
That means less learning, like young. I thought
Maybe it means he was young. You know what? I think we'll have to wait for another minute or two. All of our Rabbi Yochanan and Zakkai, Shaloiniach Mikra u'Mishnah u'Gemara halachos v'agados. That means he knew all of Mishnah, all of Mikra, all of Gemara, halachos. Apparently, he knew all halachos. Now, Moshe Rabbeinu, of course, gave halachos, transmitted halachos that were not written up in the Torah Succah and agados. So agados, we talk about midrashim, Medrash Rabbah, Medrash Tamchuma, Yalkut Shimoni, all these midrashim. Dikdukei Torah, Dikdukei Sofrim, meaning that you could derive halachos from extra words in the Torah. We're going to have a whole sugi here about Ha Ezra, the extra Hey of Ha Ezra. Now, what's the difference between the Dikdukei Torah and the Dikdukei Sofrim? I have a note here that the Dikdukei Sofrim means that when the Rabbanan instituted Gzeros and Siyagim to avoid, violating the Torah, so the Chazal had to really shots up. They had to analyze and evaluate the people and know exactly where they were holding and what Gzeros they would have to enact in order to protect them from violating the Torah. Kalim v'chamurim u'gzeros Shabbos. So Kal v'chomer we know, and he knew all the gzeros Shabbos. Tkufa, he knew how to make the calculations of the Hama and the Kochavim, to know about Ibr Shana and Kiddush HaChodesh, whether or not to make a month mole or chaser, all these astronomical calculations he was on top of. Gematrios, that I found fascinating, that he knew how to understand by calculating the numerical value of each letter, how to make combinations, and letters and words would symbolize and be metaphors for concepts. Also, gematrios include what we call atbash, which means that the aleph can substitute for the taf, first letter and the last letter, and then the base for the shin. Sichas malachi asharis, he was aware of the sounds and the communications of the malachim. Sichas shedim, he can interpret the communications amongst the shedim. Sichas dekolim, and even the communications from one tree to another. I guess when the trees sway, there's a certain meaning to their sounds. This is all based on a pasuk in Tanakh. It says about Shlomo HaMelech, "Vayedaber al ha'etzim." And I'm not sure exactly what you would learn from the eitzim. Certainly, on one level, you could extract certain medical or chemical substances from trees and use them for medicinal purposes. Mishlos are metaphors, hovsin, of launderers, and mishlos shu'olim, and of foxes. So these are all different kinds of parables, which were, Rashi says they would couch these parables in terms of foxes and launderers. I guess that's a general statement, but the Gemara analyzes. So before we see the Gemara, let's just summarize that we understand the great scope of the knowledge of Rabbi Yochanan Zakai, who's the last of the 80 Talmidim. Dover Gadol, what do you mean when you say that he mastered a Dover Gadol? That's Ma'aseh Merkava. Okay, that has to do with Yechezkel Hanavi. And it has to do with all the celestial realms of angels and divinity. And these were presented in a vision to Yechezkel. There were 4 different faces, like of animals. Or a cotton. What does it mean that he mastered over cotton? Havayis Abai V'Rav. Now, keep in mind, Rabbi Yochanan Zakai is way before Abai V'Rav. But it means that some of the questions which later on would come up and would be subjects of contention and debate between Abai and Rava were already anticipated early in time by Rabbi Yochanan Zakai. He already had an issue. He had an issue and he resolved those issues, but we don't have his answer. Therefore, Rav and Abai had to fight it out. They had to debate it. And now the Brisa says, excuse me, L'kayim Hashanema, L'hanchil Oavayech, V'yotosehem Amalek. This is a pasuk in Mishlei, and I'll read to you the translation of this pasuk into English. He says, to bequeath to those who love me, there are worlds, and they merit such immense reward because their storehouses are filled with Torah and wisdom. And now we get back to your question from before, man. If the lowest of the 80 Talmidim of Hillel, all right?
Yeah.
Is Rabbi Yochanan Zakai, right? Is Gadol Shebekula Malachas Kam V'Kama. Now again, if we're referring to the last group, which is made up of 20, and the greatest of those 20, we said, was Yonasan ben Uziah, and the last of the 20 on the rung was Rabbi Yochanan Zakai. So certainly, Yonasan ben Uziel had all of the qualities and the greatness and the knowledge and the mastery that Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakai had. But he was even greater. Amar Alav al Yonasan ben Uziel, Bishashi Yoshev Osik b'Torah, Kol Ofshe Poreach Olav Miyad Nisra. So if a bird flew over his head and he was preoccupied with the study of Torah, the bird would just burn up. Now, this burning has something to do with various malachim. You know, malachim are always, or not always, but usually are associated with Eish. Maybe because the malachim represent Midas Hadin, which is represented metaphorically by Eish. But somehow, these malachim, Rashi says, miskabtzin svivam l'shma divrei Torah mipid. The last Rashi before the Mishnah. They would somehow gravitate to Yonasan ben Uziel to hear the Torah that he was studying. Apparently, this was the way the Malach HaShares could sort of link up to the Torah. I mean, they weren't part of Matan Torah per se. They wanted to be. But at least they could link up to Yonasan ben Uziel's Torah. And if these are malachim of H, then apparently Yonasan ben Uziel's Chefta Shel Torah was also H. And therefore it would burn all these ofos. I don't know, again, whether you take it literally or not. There's a whole deal, you know, in the poskim about whether Yonasan ben Uziel would have been chayav for nezikin if somebody owned one of those birds. Could he sue him for damages? Believe it or not. All right, let's start
What's the I mean, I love it that purpose of it to tell you the greatness.
I think it's telling us about the Masorah. How is the Masorah of Torah meant to be passed on? I'll give you an example. You'll laugh. But they say about Reb Baruch Ber, he was a Talmud of Reb Chaim, that when he said over Reb Chaim's Torah, he pulled up his pants exactly where Reb Chaim would pull up his pants. Now that sounds laughable, but I think the deeper meaning of that legend, I can't vouch for its veracity, is that a Talmud should really try to imitate his Rebbe. And that's exactly what we're seeing here, that the more we learn about Rabbi Yochanan Zakkai, the more we learn about Hillel, the more we learn about Yonasan ben Uziel, and the more we learn about Rabbi Eliezer, the Talmud of Rabbi Yochanan Zakkai, we begin to see greatness and transmission of Torah, and these are the rules of the game. If you're interested, I can give you an article. Have you ever heard of Rav Hershel Schachter?
Are you?
Yes. So he has an article based on what he heard from his Rebbe about Mesoras HaTorah, about how to transmit the Torah. He'll send me a one-line email and I'll bring it in for you. All right. Mishaya Rosho Veruba Besukkah, Vishulchana Besocha Bayis. We're going to study now machlokas between Beis Hillel and Beit Shammai on two counts, the double machlokas. First of all, let's say there's only room in the sukkah for Rosho Veruba. And the shulchan can't fit in the sukkah, so the shulchan is outside of the sukkah. Is such a sukkah kshera? And the second issue is, what happens if you have enough room in your sukkah for a shulchan, in addition to Rosh Hashanah, but you left your shulchan inside the house? Can you fulfill your mitzvah? That means that even if you're leaning inside the sukkah, but because your food is sitting on the table, Beit Shammai are going to say, possibly, you're not yoked to the mitzvah. Beit Shammai poslin, meaning number one, if the sukkah doesn't have the capacity for a shulchan, it's too small, it's less than 7 tvachim square. And number two, Beit Shammai negates your kiyum mitzvah, even if there was enough room in the sukkah, but you left your shulchan inside the house. Beis Hillel machshir. Beis Hillel paskin that the sukkah is still kosher. And they're going to disagree on two counts. Number one, on the minimum size of the sukkah. Number two, on whether he was yotze the mitzvah in a case where he left the shulchan in the bayis. Amru lahem Beis Hillel. So Beis Hillel now turn to Beit Shammai. And they ask him in a rhetorical question, isn't there a story that was recorded in the history book? The elders of Beit Shammai Beis Hillel went Levakis Rabbi Yochanan ben Achoronis, they found him eating in the sukkah, and his table was in the house. Below Amru Dava, including the Ziknei Beit Shammai, they let it go by. Were they doing it out of respect? I mean, why didn't they make a protest and point out to Rebbe that this is not the mitzvah? Now, it seems that Beit Shammai had a totally different record or transmission of what exactly happened in that momentous occasion. Misham Raya. You bring a proof from there. The story is not the way you told it, but Afheim Amrulo. They told Rabbi Yochanan. Now, I'm not sure who told Rabbi Yochanan. Let's assume at least the Ziknei Beit Shammai told Rabbi Yochanan. Im Keno Yisa Noeg, Lo Kiyamta Mitzvah Sukkah Miyamecha. You never fulfilled the mitzvah of Sukkah. Why? Because you always had your shulchan inside the bayis. So this is what you call the ratio of Mishnah. And again, the poskim are very bothered by the fact that, there seems to be a machlokas in between the Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel about what exactly took place. And it's been a katza la katza. We don't find usually a machlokas, what was the story? Today you probably have it on video, so you can check it out. Now, my impression is, and Biravon Mukbal, that the reason why Rabbi Yochanan ben Achoronis had his table inside the sukkah, inside the house, is because he came lafuke from Ziknei Beit Shammai. Why did he leave his table out? Again, if he didn't have room at his table, that's one thing. And it's about the minimum size of the sukkah. But let's assume he had room, because the language of the Mishnah is shulchano b'toch habayis, that he left his shulchan in the house. So it could be that when the school of Beis Hill quoted this, they knew that the Ziknei Beit Shammai objected. That wasn't part of the debate as to what exactly happened. But they wanted to point out that since Rabbi Yochanan went out of his way to leave his shulchan in the bayis, he made a statement that he doesn't accept Ziknei Beit Shammai. So even if it's true that the Ziknei Beit Shammai says, oh, well, kiyamta sukkah mitzvah sukkah b'yamecha, that's irrelevant. Because Beis Hill want to bring a proof from Rabbi Yochanan.
That there was room for shulchan, but he left it out.
Left it out as a demonstration. He wanted to demonstrate to people, if they have Vieda, that I don't care one way or the other where your shulchan is. Grab a piece of bread from the shulchan and eat it in the sukkah. Now we go on to the second part of the Mishnah. Noshim v'avodim k'tanim p'turim min sukkah. And we'll see the Gemara is going to go through why each of these three categories are potem min sukkah. However, the Mishnah qualifies katan sheinu tzarich le'imo, if he's independent of his mother, then chayav b'sukkah. And the Gemara is going to ask, what do you mean chayav b'sukkah? He's a katan. How can he be chayav? A katan is not chayav in any mitzvah. And Maitza, this is the last part of the Mishnah. V'yolda kaloso shel Shammai azoke, the elder Shammai, his daughter-in-law gave birth, and Shammai was so machmir that piches es hamaziva v'sichech al gabe amita b'shvil hakatan. So he took off the roof, that's called the maziva, over her bed, and he was makbid to put schach for the sake of a katan, a newborn babe. So when we said katan, okay, then you have to train the katan because he's independent. But here we're talking about he does this, but he's a newborn baby. Gemara asks me, how do we know that Nachim are exempt from the mitzvah of Sukkah? The Tanura, when we learned in the Brisa, Ezra, Ze Ezra. Ha Ezra Lotzias HaNoshim. So according to this Brisa, when the Torah says that Kol Ezra B'Yisrael Yeshu B'Sukkah, the pasuk in Parshas Emor, then Ezra itself would have included women. That's how we touch the word Ezra. But the hey that's added ha Ezra is a mute, and it comes to exclude women. But then it says kol Ezra B'Yisrael Yeshu B'Sukkah, and kol is a rabbi sakkanim. And the Gemara is going to pick this up. We never found that a katan is chayv in any mitzvah. Ha Ezra lahotzias hadnashim. Your hermeneutic premise here is that the hey is coming as a mute. L'meimer de Ezra bein noshim begavri mashma. Do you mean to say that the hey is coming to be Mamayit because the word Ezra is all-inclusive, including women as well as men? Well, Sanya, I have another brisa that contradicts this principle. And the brisa is talking about the mitzvah of Inui on Yom Kippur. And there too, the Torah says that Kol Ezra B'Yisrael. And if we have I don't want to not waste, it's just that the pressure is tremendous here. So, but if you have a Chumash by Yikra, we'll read the pasuk inside. But in the meantime, I don't want to. Anyway, you'll trust me. The pasuk says Ezra also with regard to Yom Kippur in Perek Zayin, pasuk Chaf Tes. And the Brisa says, "Ha'ezrach lerabos es hanoshim ha'ezrachios shechayavos be'inu." That the word ha'ezrach is coming to teach me that women are included in the obligation of Inu and Yom Kippur. It's Tes Zion, Chaf Tes. Again, I apologize. I just have to keep moving. Otherwise, I'm in trouble. Alma, Ezrach Gavri Mashma. The word Ezrach without the Hey means only men. And the Hey is coming not as a miut, but as a ribui to include women. Omar Rabba says, Hilchas Aninu, Yasmechinu Rabbanan Akroi. And it's very vague. He's saying that one of these two drushos of the two respective brisos is a halacha l'moshe misina. The other is the exact opposite. Rabbanan just looked for a smachta. So the Gemara says, "Hey kra v'hei hilchasa," which is which? The su kra lamali hilchasa lamali. And furthermore, why do I need both a pasuk and a hilchasa? Gemara says, "Oh, Sukkah mitzvah seishis mein grom, kol mitzvah seishis mein grom, not shem turis." I don't need a pasuk to exempt women from Sukkah. It's absolutely clear that women are exempt from Sukkah. Not only that, I don't need a pasuk to include women in the mitzvah of Inui. It's absolutely clear that women are included in the mitzvah of Inui. Yom Kippurim, mida Rabbi Yehuda Marav nafka, derived from the principle of Rabbi Yehuda. The Yom Rabbi Yehuda Marav. V'chein toned bei Rabbi Shmuel. Omar Kra, the pasuk says in the beginning of Sefer Bamidbar, it says, Ish o Isha, and we're talking about at the end of Parshas Bamidbar. It says that if they take a false oath and they have to bring a korban asham, etc., etc., and it says Ish o Isha.